will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to analyze the ongoing crisis in Venezuela and the United States' response to Nicolas Maduro's attempt to steal Venezuelans' election on the 28th of July. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. And I need to say that this is one of the most important hearings that I will do, or that I have done in my time in Congress, and the only one, unfortunately, that the United States Congress, including the Senate, will be conducting on the stolen elections in Venezuela. So, in that country, in Venezuela, there is a cruel contradiction that has unfolded. Maduro has intensified its brutality through jail and death. In the meantime, unfortunately, American and European oil companies led by Chevron, Repsol, Eni, and Morel have now increased their pumping and their profits, directly fueling the tyrannical machinery of oppression. Look at this poster right here. As oppression goes up, so does the desire of companies to do business with Maduro. Shame on them. And here is the proof. Let's see. Let's go over here. Look. Let's start with Chevron. Chevron, $435 million in the month of August. Repsol, $100 million. And Morel, France, $96 million in profits. I represent the city of Miami. We are pro-capitalism. We are pro-free market economy. I am very much pro-energy sector, making a lot of money. But there are lines you do not cross when profiting from other people's miseries. Since the day of the election, 2,500 Venezuelans have been thrown in jail and a bunch more have been killed. Anyone who opposes Maduro faces a so-called re-education plan at prisons, which in reality are concentration camps by the names of Tocorón and Tocuyito. In other words, as Venezuelan jails are crammed to unprecedented levels, and all these are facts, so are the Maduro coffers, courtesy of American and European companies. Once again, shame on you. Chevron, Repsol, Eni, and Morel, blood is on your hands, and it will be on yours, the Biden administration, and on us, the United States Congress, if we do not act today. We are the United States, regardless of the party. We are the beacon of hope. We are the land of liberty. We're the moral leaders of the world. We're the beacon of democracy. So let's behave accordingly. The Dems and the Republicans. Venezuelan oil exports are at the highest level in 4 years, close to 1 million barrels a day. Right here it is. Look, almost 900,000. Look at the graph. Last month, Maduro made $666 million. What a figure, huh? What does that remind you of? Exactly who he is, the devil. 666. So what is it that we have to do right now, the Dems and the Republicans together, specifically the Biden administration, who has all the power in your hands? First of all, I believe that we have to put a pause on every oil license for Venezuela granted by the Treasury Department, a department that the State Department guides what to do. We know very well that we are in an election cycle and that the White House needs cheap gas at the pump because it's all politics. But you know, we can buy it from our friends, Guyana or Ecuador or Colombia, or we can pump it here at home. That's number one. Number two, there's a guy by the name of Edmundo Gonzalez who won the presidential election fair and square. He won 70% of the vote, according to all data. So why don't we recognize him as the legitimate president of Venezuela right now, as you, the Biden administration, accorded in Barbados? Maduro, you hold elections, and we are going to lift the sanctions. We lifted the sanctions, but he did not hold free and fair elections. Number 3, let's confiscate Maduro's buddies' properties. No more Disney World or Broadway, while Maria Corina Machado's supporters are being beaten on the streets and raped in jail. Spain, Argentina, and Panama should be doing the same thing. These assets are fruits of a poisonous tree with roots steeped in suffering. And finally, you know that Nicolás Maduro and Diosdado Cabello are wanted criminals by the FBI. We know it. It's on the website of the State Department website. So the Department of Justice should put a price tag of $25 million on their heads, which is the maximum amount that it's allowed by law. I am sure, distinguished gentlemen, that someone in the Venezuelan armed forces will be highly motivated to put their heads on a silver platter for that amount of money, period. That is what they deserve. If we, the Biden administration and the Republicans, do not fix this mess, we're going to have another 4 million Venezuelans knocking on our southern border tomorrow. They do not want to leave their home. So why don't we help them to stay? By bringing back democracy. Now I'm going to say a few words in Spanish for the Venezuelans who are watching me in Venezuela. Ustedes no están solos. Millones de ustedes en la oposición han hecho una labor titánica al frente de una mujer que es altamente especial y que pasará a la historia venezolana. La dictadura de Maduro se sostiene por el miedo, por lo cual significa que no va a poder sostenerse para siempre. No tiene el apoyo de la gente, ahí lo demostró las elecciones. Caerá y caerá pronto. Sigan de pie, no desfallezcan. Nosotros estamos con ustedes. Now, the chair now recognizes the ranking member, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, for a statement he may have.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for your testimony today on this very important issue in Latin America. And welcome to our witnesses from the State Department and USAID. Thank you so much for your work. This is a timely hearing on what I believe is one of the most pressing issues in Latin America, at least, the humanitarian and political crisis in Venezuela. First and foremost, let me be clear about the facts. I've said and continue to believe that the July 28th Venezuela elections represent the biggest opportunity for Venezuelan democracy in years. The Biden administration was right to support the Venezuelan opposition's efforts to negotiate the conditions for a competitive election. Nobody expected the elections to be free or fair, and they clearly weren't. The Maduro regime disqualified eligible candidates, intimidated voters, and attempted to manipulate the playing field to ensure his victory. And also, let me be clear, on July 28th, the people of Venezuela, amidst intimidation, threats, and harassment, overwhelmingly voted for Edmundo Gonzalez to be their next president. The regime, knowing it lost, and lost big, refused to release the election results as required by Venezuelan law. And so I know there's been some debate particularly in Venezuela and Latin America, about who has the burden of proof to show they won the election there. It was required by Venezuelan law for the government to release those results, and they did not. Despite this, and due to the brave actions of Venezuelans fighting for their democracy, the official tallies from over 80% of polling sites were released, uploaded online, and verified, clearly demonstrating that Edmundo Gonzalez received enough votes to win. In a shocking display of authoritarianism, the regime-backed National Electoral Council of Venezuela announced that Nicolás Maduro won the elections without releasing any election results. Following this transparent attempt to steal the election, the regime has engaged in mass repression and violence and intimidation of foreign governments, including through threats to diplomatic missions protected by the Vienna Convention. In doing so, Maduro has alienated the vast majority of the Venezuelan people that voted for Mr. Gonzalez and diplomatically isolated his own country in our hemisphere. I want to recognize that the Venezuelan opposition, against all odds, was able to unify and create a strong, diverse coalition of those ready for a new democratic chapter in their country. These were folks who ideologically were both on the right and the left. These elections created an opening for Venezuelan democracy, but it's ultimately an opening that must be followed up upon. We must continue to engage with the political opposition, both in country and exile, civil society, and local communities in Venezuela to find a real, durable path forward. We must work with our democratic allies in the region to explore all diplomatic avenues and present a unified front against Maduro's dictatorship. The United States is not and cannot be the primary actor here. Nicolas Maduro has attempted to characterize the overwhelming desire of Venezuelans for change as a plot of the United States to topple his regime, which plays into his hand. This is about the Venezuelan people's fight for their democratic rights. It's not about us. As important as the United States' actions are, our role is and should be a supporting one. Governments across the political spectrum, on the left and the right, have recognized Maduro's actions as illegitimate and unacceptable. That includes Chile, the Dominican Republic, Guatemala, Panama, Argentina, and others. Other nations, including Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico, have not recognized Maduro's claims of victory, an important signal. We must take advantage of each of our country's individual relationships and strengths to unequivocally stand behind those in Venezuela, not only in just achieving their goals of establishing democracy and protection of human rights, but to also address the humanitarian and migration crisis that has wide-reaching consequences around the region. Elections are but one part of the entire democratic process. As we have seen recently in Guatemala, Brazil, and even the United States, what happens between Election Day and Inauguration Day matters. I believe, as dire as the situation is, that it's not over. What happens in Venezuela matters for the United States and for the region. The ultimate outcome of this election, both in the positions and countries that countries take, and whether the results are ultimately honored, will be a significant test for democracy in our hemisphere. I hope during this hearing that the State Department and USAID will articulate how the United States will approach the next few months and how we'll support the democratic process in Venezuela. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the United States will support these efforts. I yield back, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. And other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Today, we have witnesses from the State Department and the USAID who cover American interests in South America for the Biden administration. Starting with the Honorable Kevin Sullivan, is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Brazil, Southern Cone, and the Andean Affairs for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the United States Department of State. And Mr. Enrique Roy is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor at the U.S. Department of State as well. And Mr. Greg Howell is a Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean of the U.S. Agency for International Development. Thank you all for being here. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes. I now recognize Ambassador Sullivan for his opening statement. And welcome, sir.
Good morning. Chairwoman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today.
Could you use the mic, please?
Thank you for this opportunity to testify today at this critical moment in Venezuela's history. The U.S. government has remained steadfast in our commitment to support the people of Venezuela in their democratic aspirations. Last October, the Venezuelan Democratic Opposition and representatives of Nicolas Maduro signed the Barbados Agreement, a roadmap for resolving Venezuela's political, economic, and humanitarian crisis by creating the conditions needed to hold competitive and inclusive elections in Venezuela. Soon after, Maria Corina Machado won the opposition's primary election to run as their consensus presidential candidate overwhelmingly, with over 90% of the vote. the U.S. government took steps to incentivize the competitive election. Also in October, the Department of the Treasury issued a temporary general license authorizing transactions in Venezuela's oil and natural gas sector for 6 months. However, in January, the Maduro-backed Supreme Justice Tribunal unjustly barred Maria Corina Machado from holding office, and her chosen replacement was also prevented from registering to run for president. In response to this anti-democratic behavior and repression by Maduro, Treasury announced the end of that general license for oil and gas activities, but we continued to push for a competitive presidential election. Just prior to the registration deadline, Maduro's National Electoral Commission allowed Edmundo González Urrutia to register as the opposition's consensus candidate. González campaigned throughout the country with Maria Corina Machado beside him, drew enormous crowds, and remained on the ballot through Election Day. On July 28th, the Venezuelan people turned out in truly historic numbers. More than 12 million Venezuelans voted in the face of threats, arrests, arbitrary rules, and intimidation. They voted to express their desire for peaceful democratic change in their country. Pre-election polls, opinion polls, election day exit polls, precinct-level results collected by Democratic opposition poll watchers all pointed to a clear victory for Edmundo González. Yet hours later, the Maduro-controlled CNE declared Nicolás Maduro the winner. To this day, the CNE has not published the precinct-level results or presented any other evidence to substantiate its baseless claim of a Maduro victory. By contrast, shortly after the election, the Democratic opposition posted online official precinct-level tally sheets representing more than 80% of all polling places nationwide. These tally sheets, which have been corroborated by independent observers and electoral experts, show clearly that Edmundo González won 67% of the vote to Maduro's 30%. The opposition's impressive effort to collect this polling station information is a testament to their organization and tenacity, and to the people of Venezuela, who at great risk came out to demand that their voices be heard. The Carter Center and the UN panel of experts, who had been invited by Maduro representatives to observe the election, each published independent assessments noting that the tally sheets collected and released by the opposition appeared genuine, while the CNE announcement of the election results claiming Maduro won lacked transparency and integrity and failed to meet even basic democratic standards. Maduro and his allies have continued to refuse to recognize the will of the Venezuelan people or to heed the repeated calls from the international community to release detailed election results, and have instead launched widespread repression in an effort to cling to power. My colleague from DRL can provide additional details about that. Winning candidate Edmundo González Urrutia is now in Spain because Maduro representatives issued a warrant for his arrest on baseless, politically motivated charges. The United States and international partners have clearly signaled to Maduro and his representatives that their actions and fraudulent claims to have won the elections are unacceptable. Few governments have recognized Maduro's shameless attempt to claim victory. On September 12th, the Departments of Treasury and State announced sanctions and visa restrictions on Maduro-aligned officials for their role in election manipulation and the repressive aftermath of the elections. We're working with our partners in the international community to coordinate additional efforts to hold Maduro and his representatives accountable. Democratic governments in the region and beyond are unified in pressing Maduro for transparency and an end to the repression with strong U.S. leadership and support. The Organization of American States, for example, adopted a U.S.-led resolution by consensus. More than 50 countries supported Panama's statement of concern in New York outside the UN Security Council last week. With the UN General Assembly approaching, we are leading additional lines of diplomatic effort with our partners to continue applying pressure. Distinguished members of the committee, If we had said 2 years ago that Venezuela would hold competitive elections resulting in a clear victory by a consensus candidate representing democratic change, few would have believed it. But that's where we are today, thanks to the Venezuelan people's bravery and resilience, the organizational capacity and resourcefulness of Venezuela's democratic opposition, and many other partners in the international community. A sizable majority of Venezuelans chose Edmundo González Urrutia and peaceful democratic change, not 6 more years of Nicolás Maduro. And the world sees that more clearly than ever after the July 28th election. The United States will continue to advocate for Venezuelan-led discussions that lead to respect for the will of the Venezuelan people, peaceful resolution of this crisis, a return to democratic norms, and an end to the repression and violence. The people of Venezuela deserve nothing less. Thank you.
To you, Ambassador. Thank you, Ambassador Sullivan. I now recognize Mr. Roig for his opening statement. Thank you, sir, and welcome.
Chairwoman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today about the ongoing human rights violations in Venezuela following the July 28th presidential election. The post-election repression in Venezuela has been both severe and unprecedented in the country's history. Nicolás Maduro's regime has resorted to a campaign of violence and intimidation aimed at suppressing the democratic opposition and the Venezuelan people. As of September 9th, there have been 24 deaths and over 2,000 detentions, including 84 minors, linked directly to the regime's crackdown on those contesting the National Electoral Commission's election results. The daily average number of detained or disappeared is nearly 10 times higher than the pre-election average. Security forces routinely stop citizens to review their WhatsApp messaging chats for potential organizing involvement and deployed an app for Maduro sympathizers to report suspected efforts to assemble. The anti-NGO law passed by Maduro's National Assembly in August, along with revival of the law against fascism, highlight Maduro's intentions to undermine civil society. These laws are designed to make it nearly impossible for NGOs and opposition organizations to operate in Venezuela, limiting their ability to provide services, organize, or campaign freely. The case of CNE Rector Juan Carlos Del Pino is particularly concerning. As one of 2 opposition-aligned CNE members, Del Pino exposed election irregularities, stating the CNE had no evidence Maduro won. He has since gone into hiding, fearing retribution. Edmundo González Urrutia, who won the most votes on July 28th, faces an arrest warrant without legitimate charges and has sought refuge in Spain due to credible threats to his and his family's safety. The Department of State, including the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, remains deeply committed to supporting the Venezuelan opposition, human rights defenders, and civil society. We are engaged in direct communication with opposition leaders, including Edmundo González and Maria Corina Machado. Secretary Blinken spoke with both leaders shortly after the election to express U.S. concerns for their safety and support for their democratic cause, and continues to do so. We have also supported Venezuelan defenders of democracy through multilateral diplomacy. The Organization of American States passed a U.S.-sponsored resolution that calls for transparency, impartial review of the election results, and the protection of election integrity. Additionally, the United States continues to work through the UN Human Rights Council in supporting the renewal of the mandate of the fact-finding mission on Venezuela. The fact-finding mission plays a vital role in the international community's efforts to hold the Maduro regime accountable for human rights abuses. The United States also joined the European Union and 28 other governments in a Human Rights Council joint statement on Venezuela, demanding an end to repression and the release of detained opposition figures. It is also worth noting that on September 12th, the United States, along with 50 other countries, joined Panama's foreign minister outside the UN Security Council to call on Venezuelans to begin constructive and inclusive discussions to restore democratic norms. Despite these actions, the operating environment in Venezuela remains dire. NGOs and opposition figures struggle amidst violence, legal harassment, and censorship. The Anti-NGO Act criminalizes essential civil society activities, restricts international funding, imposes burdensome regulations, and threatens organizations challenging the regime's narrative. Maduro's regime also controls the media landscape, making it difficult for the opposition to disseminate their message. Social media platforms, a critical tool for the opposition, have been targeted by regime surveillance and internet blackouts. Despite these challenges, the opposition continues to rally support. Unfortunately, direct access to detained figures such as opposition leaders or activists remains extremely limited. Maduro has made it clear that international organizations and governments will face barriers to oversight, as demonstrated by the closure of the OHCHR office in Venezuela. Implementing programs is increasingly difficult, with many activities revised or postponed given the ongoing repression. During the most intense digital repression wave the country has ever experienced, DRL programs have maintained uninterrupted access to blocked content. DRL programs have also been documenting cases of political prisoners and arbitrary detentions, informing the world on current patterns that have emerged post-election. Additionally, DRL programs have helped unify communities and networks that share the desire for a restoration of the other countries' democracy, and DRL remains committed to continuing its essential support. In closing, the human rights violations and abuses following the July 28th election in Venezuela are a direct attack on the country's democracy. Maduro's regime uses severe repression to systematically stifle dissent and cling to power. The United States remains steadfast in its support for Venezuelan civil society, opposition leaders, and the democratic aspirations of the Venezuelan people. We will continue to work tirelessly with the international community to apply pressure, demand accountability, and support those who are fighting for a free and democratic Venezuela. This is evident from our announcement on September 12th of sanctions and visa restrictions on individuals undermining the electoral process and suppressing the democratic opposition. Chairwoman Salazar and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions and to working with this committee in the future. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, Mr. Roy. I now recognize Mr. Howell for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, and members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to testify today on this vitally important issue. As you know, on July 28th, the Venezuelan people went to the polls en masse to let their voices be heard. Their message was unequivocal. By historic margins, they chose Edmundo Gonzalez, a former diplomat, to bring about a new era of change and democratic governance in Venezuela. Yet Maduro has gone to great lengths to avoid recognizing the true election results. Since July 28th, he's wielded his control over the National Electoral Council to announce fake election results without presenting a shred of evidence. He has also wielded his control over the Supreme Court in an attempt to grant a veneer of legitimacy to the National Electoral Council's lies. Maduro has also unleashed an unprecedented wave of repression. He's unjustly detained journalists, political actors, and human rights defenders. These political prisoners are held in inhumane conditions and frequently subjected to torture. Tragically, many of those are minors. Most notably, Maduro has directed baseless charges and intimidation at Edmundo Gonzalez, causing him to flee the country. Despite the dire situation in Venezuela today, we cannot lose sight of the fact that Venezuelan voters, democracy activists, candidates, and political parties have achieved something truly extraordinary. Long divided by ideology and personality, the Venezuelan opposition came together last summer in a primary election to choose Maria Corina Machado by overwhelming margins and with stunning participation rates. When Maduro blocked Machado from running, the Democratic coalition remained united, ultimately following her lead to support Edmundo Gonzalez as their candidate for president. And despite the threats, the arrests, and a broadcast media blackout that aimed to silence the Gonzalez campaign, Venezuelans sought out information and participated in rallies. As the election approached, civil society and democracy activists informed and registered voters as Maria Corina Machado campaigned alongside Edmundo Gonzalez. And on election day, opposition poll watchers risked their lives to remain in voting centers and demand election results from each polling center as stipulated by Venezuela's election law. And in the days after the election, they were able to put together those results and prove that Edmundo Gonzalez beat Nicolas Maduro by a margin of over 35%. They did what Maduro and his electoral council have refused to do, making the results public so that the will of the Venezuelan people would be known to the entire world. USAID is very proud to support democratic actors in Venezuela and around the world. We work to support their ability to organize internally, broaden their democratic coalition, exercise their freedoms of expression and peaceful assembly, and defend democratic principles. Our programs also enhance the Venezuelan people's access to uncensored information by supporting independent media reporting. At this critical time, our programs are focused on strengthening civil society and human rights organizations' capacities to report effectively on the dire human rights situation in the country and carry out oversight of the activities of Maduro and his representatives. In the days after the election, we've seen countries around the world rally for the cause of Venezuela and a democracy there. Leaders from across the political spectrum are calling for transparency, and several have joined the United States in acknowledging Edmundo Gonzalez's overwhelming victory. Shamefully, Maduro has ignored the international community's call for transparency. If Maduro continues to ignore the will of the Venezuelan people, there's real concern that many more Venezuelans will begin to leave their country soon, in addition to the nearly 8 million who have already fled. As the Venezuelan people continue to fight for democracy, it's crucial that we continue building international support for a democratic transition in Venezuela. We must ensure that the international community does not turn away from the Venezuelan people who have risked so much to make their voices heard and their votes counted. Thank you very much.
To you, Mr. Howell, thank you for your statement. Thank you very much for being here. And then I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Well, I think that after having heard three of you, we're all on the same page. We agree that Maduro stole the elections. You guys have, you gentlemen have said that severe and unprecedented repression, minors 10 times higher than before the elections, the detentions that the CNE guy or that gentleman that now is in hiding said that Maduro did not win, inhumane conditions to minors. The CNE is not publishing the voting tallies. So we all agree. So my question this to you, to Mr. Sullivan, is what? On September 1st, 33 days after Maduro did everything that you guys described, the United States renewed the license for Chevron to operate in Venezuela. If you don't have money, you do not have money to grease the repressive apparatus or the police state. Why did you do that? Why the State Department renewed that license? Specific, general, individual. We don't need to go into the words. I just want to know, why did you do that? And do not tell me that Treasury told you, because state dictates and Treasury follows.
Thanks for the question, Chairwoman Salazar. As you know, decisions about sanctions are made with interagency consultation. They are taken. The sanctions are administered by the Treasury Department, and they make the announcements on them.
State tells Treasury what to do. Do not try to fool me, Mr. Sullivan. We know that the State Department is the one that dictates foreign policy. And if the State Department did not want Chevron and Repsol and the others to have a general or individual or specific, whatever type of license, Treasury would have not granted it. Am I correct?
We continue to review our sanctions policy.
Yes or no? Why did you, the State Department, renew the license for Chevron, our company, 33 days after Maduro did everything you guys described? There has to be a reason. Did the White House put pressure on you? Did they call and say, hey, we need free, cheap oil?
Well, as I mentioned, Chairwoman Salazar,
Yes, sir.
The U.S. government coordinates on these issues. Treasury administers the licenses, and we continue to review our sanctions policy with respect to Venezuela with a view to advancing our overall objectives of promoting, in this case, a democratic transition.
How can you promote a democratic transition if we have agreed that Maduro stole the election? And all we're doing is helping him stay in power and creating another migrant crisis, because the other gentleman, Mr. Roy, just said it. We're talking about 4 million Venezuelans have said publicly that they're going to leave if Maduro stays, because there's no food, because there are no jobs, because they're repressive apparatus. So again, explain to me how come you decided to not only give to Chevron, but to all the others that are just fueling the regime. Tell me.
So since the election, as you've seen, the U.S. has been very active with our international partners in developing concerted international pressure in favor of transparency, publication of the
You are
tally
not
sheets.
answering my question, Mr. Sullivan. Why did you renew the oil licenses for Chevron? Why?
So administration of our sanctions policy is something that we do as part of our overall diplomatic strategy in Venezuela. And we continue to review that policy, trying to choose targeted actions that will best contribute to our overall efforts to create conditions for the Venezuelan
I
peoples to be
understand,
respected.
but you sponsored the Barbados Accords. And the Accords said that you were going to lift sanctions, meaning the State Department, the United States of America was going to lift sanctions if Maduro played by the rules that he signed in Barbados. Maduro, to just explain, did not play, not even by one of the rules. So then why did you give the ability for them to continue making money?
So I think you know, Chairwoman, that we, about a week ago, announced additional individual sanctions to hold accountable some of the key officials that were involved with the electoral manipulation that we're talking about, as well as some of the brutal repression that we've detailed in our testimony. That was a way in which we are beginning to hold accountable those associated with Maduro who have been most responsible.
And that is fantastic. Those people then cannot leave Venezuela and go to Disney World or go to Broadway or enjoy the fruits of what they stole. I got it, but I'm talking about our oil companies. And not only ours, but you're not answering my question. So I'm going to go to the next one. 50 companies have applied for a Venezuelan oil license. 50. Shell from Netherlands. Did you grant a license? Yes or no? To Shell.
I would refer you to OFAC and the Department of Treasury with respect to decisions on
Treasury
individual-
follows state. Did you advise Treasury, yes or no, on Shell?
And
I'm going to make it easy for you. Shell, ONGC Videsh from India, Amos Global from the United States, Kirui Petroleum from Chinese. Because the thing is that the international community, since they don't want to have a problem with the United States, they come to the United States government and says, hey, could I do business with Venezuela? You will not be upset if I do, right? So that's why we have to grant licenses to other people who are not Americans. So I'm asking again, Chevron and the rest, 50 companies, how many licenses have you granted? And the only reason why I'm doing this is because if you grant a license, Maduro has money and he can beat Maria Corina's supporters on the streets and rape the people in jail. You understand that, right? Money means repression. No money means less repression. Am I right? What am I saying? Where am I wrong? Where do you think I'm wrong?
Chairwoman, in terms of specific license applications, I really can't speak to individual decisions on that. What I can tell you
I'm only asking you yes or no.
What I can tell you is that, first of all, we do consider the revenue that is generated for Maduro as we consider these decisions. We also consider other factors, broader U.S. interests, as well as where we stand in our broader diplomatic efforts in addressing this problem.
Sir, don't you understand that Maduro is laughing at us? And we are the leaders. You said, one of you gentlemen, you said we're trying to garner some international support. We are the leaders. If the United States is not at the head, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, the rest are, you know this. You guys are career diplomats. You're serving the country. You're trying to do your very best. I'm not passing any judgment. I'm only passing judgment on the decisions that the State Department has taken. And I'm asking you, why? And you haven't answered.
Well, You mentioned the diplomatic efforts that we've been engaged in, and the U.S. has taken a leadership role in a number of fora, from the OAS
In a
to
very
the UN.
weak manner. That's why Maduro is going like that.
Well,
And we are granting licenses to these people. That's the number one tool we have. Do you agree with me?
We certainly agree that sanctions are an important part of our toolkit, and that's why we have used them most recently on September 12th, as I mentioned, and we have certainly not ruled out additional actions going forward, whether individual or broader sanctions. Those
All
are
right, so I'm
things-
going to ask again, and then you're not asking me, you're not answering, and I understand your position. We're in a democracy. You are not telling me, you're not giving me any information. Is there any way that there is a conversation in Treasury or in the State Department to make a decision, consider the possibility of putting a pause on any of these licenses? Yes or no?
Yes, in the sense that we
Good.
are always assessing how we can best utilize our sanctions.
Do you think that there is a movement within the State Department, starting with Secretary Blinken, to put a pause on any of these licenses and send the message to Maduro, no, my money it's no more money's coming in?
So we are going to continue to consider the whole range of sanctioning options that we have available based on what we see from Maduro, how the situation develops, as well as what we think is going to be the most effective response.
But sir, you're sending a very weak message to Maduro. I'm sure they're analyzing this hearing to the T. Now, next one, Gonzalez. Why don't we recognize him as the legitimate president of Venezuela, like we, past administration, did with Guaido? Why don't we say, yeah, Gonzalez is the legitimate president of the country? Why don't we do that?
There's absolutely no doubt that Edmundo González Urrutia won the most votes in the election. We've said that clearly. Many other governments have also said that. As my colleague mentioned, the Secretary of State has spoken with Edmundo a number of times
Why
now.
don't we recognize him? We can talk to him 1,000 times, but we got to say publicly, we, the United States, we believe you are the legitimate president, just like we did with Guaido. Why don't we do the same thing with Gonzalez?
So we have recognized that he won the election, and we have called on the Maduro institutions to release the tallies that show that he won the election, as the opposition has essentially already done in the case of 80% of the polling stations. We have also categorically rejected the efforts of the CNE to certify Maduro as the president-elect of Venezuela, as well as the TSJ's efforts to ratify that certification. And in addition,
Very weak.
in
We
addition
are
to
very weak in the eyes of the Maduro regime, and it's costing us and the rest of the hemisphere. Mr. Roig, 4 million Venezuelans, or Mr. Howell, if you want to give me your opinion, 4 million Venezuelans will be knocking on our door very soon. They have said it, they have announced it. If this money coming in continues, 1,000 Venezuelans are leaving every day. What can we do about that? Because the border is, I mean, we're allowing them because it's asylum, political asylum they are asking. So how do you see Mr. Roig or Mr. Howell?
Thank you, Chairwoman Salazar. USAID and U.S. government is working very closely with countries across the region, including Brazil, Colombia, and Ecuador, which have made very bold policy commitments to welcome migrants into their communities.
They can't
and their
hold anymore. It's 8 million Venezuelans who fled. Most of them are in South America. Those countries do not have the public services to provide to these new migrants. So they're coming to the United States, including El Tren de Aragua, because that everything comes in, unfortunately. So do we have any plans?
Yeah, again, we're continuing to strengthen the capacities of those governments, in particular Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Ecuador. Surveys have shown that migrants from Venezuela prefer to migrate to those countries, and we will continue to work with them to build their capacities both at a national level and a municipal level to be able to welcome migrants from Venezuela. But currently, we're not seeing a significant uptick in migration since the election, but certainly it is a concern.
Thank you. I now recognize Ranking Member Castro for 5 minutes, and thank you for your patience.
I'm going to allow Representative Stanton to go first because he's got a plane to catch.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member Castro and Chair Salazar, for your leadership and putting together this very important hearing. Thank you to the brave voters, opposition leaders, and election observers in Venezuela for their belief in democratic systems. On July 28th, Venezuelans turned out in impressive numbers to vote for the return of democracy, economic opportunity, and rule of law, and yet their votes were ignored. Maduro still claims to have won, declaring without proof that he won over 51% of the vote. Maduro's lackeys have cracked down violently on protests, killing 24 people, arresting almost 2,000 political prisoners, and the opposition candidate Edmundo Gonzalez has been forced into exile. And of course, Edmundo Gonzalez wasn't even supposed to be the candidate. Maria Corina Machado overwhelmingly won the primary elections, but was wrongfully removed from the ballot by the Venezuelan Supreme Court. Deputy Assistant Secretary Sullivan, the U.S. has recognized Gonzalez's victory on August 1st. Tell us how the administration came to this conclusion.
Thanks for your question, Congressman Stanton. As I mentioned earlier, we drew the conclusion that Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia had clearly won the most votes, primarily based on the opposition's release of the tally sheets from over 80% of the voting tables and the judgments of the international electoral experts on the authenticity of those returns. Based on those returns, there was no mathematical way that Nicolás Maduro could have won, even if if he'd won every outstanding vote remaining in the other 20%. It really was an overwhelming election. And at this stage, really the whole world knows that Nicolás Maduro lost that election. I think there's almost unanimity of views on that. The Venezuelan people know he lost. The Venezuelan military knows that he lost. And all over the international community, I think that fact has been recognized. I would note that also the results of the actual election coincided very closely with credible polling prior to the election, as well as exit polling that was conducted on election day. So they're just further indications of that. So really, it's remarkable that we are here now, that that election happened, that the opposition was able to run in it, that they were able to capture the results from that election and present them in a credible way. Our job now in the international community is to support them as they seek to ensure that the will of the Venezuelan people is respected and that the democratic transition that Venezuelans overwhelmingly voted for actually happens.
Unfortunately, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico have remained neutral so far, mainly calling for proof of results and suggesting a variety of solutions. Brazil's President Lula suggested that Venezuela hold new elections, and Colombia's President Petro suggested that Maduro and Gonzalez form a coalition government. Deputy Assistant Secretary Sullivan, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico have tried to act as intermediaries between Maduro and the opposition. Have there been any success in that regard? How do you anticipate that President-elect Claudia Sheinbaum inauguration will change Mexico's focus on Venezuela? She, of course, will be inaugurated October 1st. Are there other countries better positioned to act as intermediaries?
Thanks for the question, Congressman. We have really been quite happy with the role that Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico have been willing to play. In many cases, those leaders have had long relationships with Maduro and his associates, but nonetheless, they have recognized that the way that Maduro conducted the election and withheld the election results really is just not democratic and not credible. And they have, number one, called on Maduro to release those results and to respect them, and have indicated that they would not acknowledge Maduro's election result until and unless he did so. That's really quite an evolution from where those governments might have been a few years ago. And because of that, those longstanding relationships, we've been hopeful that they could play a helpful role in overall international efforts. We believe those efforts are ongoing. We hope that Maduro will take counsel from those leaders about transparency and respect for democratic norms. We are also hopeful that the incoming Mexican president will also maintain those standards. We, of course, have engaged with a much broader range of international partners, both in the region, in the Americas, as well as in Europe and beyond. We've found enormous support for respect for the democratic process in all of those places. So we are hopeful that concerted international pressure will have a positive effect, and we'll continue to work with any countries who can help promote a Venezuelan-led dialogue that can get us to a peaceful democratic transition.
Thank you very much. Ranking Member, thank you for your professional courtesy.
Thanks to you, Representative Stanton. Now we are going to give the time to Representative Green from Tennessee. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The crisis in Venezuela is tragic. Millions of citizens disenfranchised, nearly 2,000 are imprisoned, including children. Dozens have been killed protesting the violation of their rights, all while the government issues this constant stream of lies and propaganda. But it's really not new. It's all too familiar. The methods of repression that we've seen in Venezuela in recent weeks are textbook Cuban tactics for crushing dissent, terrorizing people. And it's hardly surprising to those of us who've been paying attention. The expansive Cuban presence in Venezuela answers a lot of questions about the nature and intentions of the Maduro regime. Back in 2021, under the Trump administration, the State Department reported, and I quote, "The Cuban intelligence and security apparatus has infiltrated Venezuela's security and military forces, assisting Nicolas Maduro to maintain his stronghold over his people while allowing terrorist organizations to operate freely." As Maria Corina Machado said in a recent interview, and again I quote, "We have known for a long time that Cuba has had a terrible impact in multiple areas, in methods of repression, persecution, espionage, and torture. And we've seen truly heartless things in recent days. But not only are these tyrannical tactics similar, the U.S. response to them is also strikingly familiar. Just as Democrats turned a blind eye to the Cuban repression and the Biden-Harris administration relieves pressure on the Cuban government, so too are we seeing the same thing happening with our diplomatic relations with Venezuela. Despite the Trump administration's refusing to recognize the fraudulent Maduro regime in 2019, along with the EU and 14 other countries in the Western Hemisphere, the Biden and Harris administration decided to change course and bring the Maduro regime back into the fold. From releasing a criminal and high-ranking Maduro ally to providing sanctions relief leading up to the stolen election, this administration paved the road on which Venezuelans and their rights were trampled by Nicolas Maduro. Evil flourishes in the absence of strength. Given the abject failure of this administration to maintain strength and diplomacy with both Cuba and Venezuela, my question is this: what is the administration planning to do or say about the malign Cuban influence in Venezuela that is helping Maduro in his refusal to accept the will of the Venezuelan people and terrorize those demanding respect for their vote? And I'll go with you, Ambassador Sullivan.
Thank you, Congressman. I would say that certainly we've all been horrified by the increasing repression we've seen in Venezuela, particularly since the electoral result. My colleagues have detailed some of the really disturbing aspects of that, including the targeting of minors in some cases. These are...
Yeah, you don't have to go back over the horrible things that have happened to consume time. Just tell me, first, let me just ask this. Is Maduro being helped by Cuba to stay in power?
Yes.
Okay, so what are we doing about that?
So you mentioned some of the reports and assessments that the U.S. government has done in the past on Cuban involvement in Venezuela. We have not seen recent specific information on that in terms of their involvement in recent days, but it's something we're continuing to monitor and can address when we have a clear case.
You're avoiding the question or the answer to the question. I mean, you're doing more research. Got it. You're digging more in to figure out their degree of involvement.
I'll be happy
What are
to-
we doing to stop it?
I'll be happy to take your question back, and we'll provide you with additional information.
Okay. How has, again, to you, and I think your title isn't, it's Deputy Secretary, right?
Deputy Assistant Secretary.
Yes, Deputy Assistant Secretary. My apologies for that. How has the Maduro regime's, crackdown and corruption and all this pushed immigration into the United States?
Well, Maduro's misrule over the last several years has resulted in the outflow of over 7 million Venezuelans. Some of them have left because of direct political repression, others because of the economic failures of Maduro. In any case, they're all really related to the way Maduro has run Venezuela over the last several years. We've seen over the last couple of years in particular a heightened outflow. My colleague Greg Howell talked about some of the efforts we've undertaken with others in the region to help the whole region cope with the impact of those outflows.
Do you know how many people have come across from Venezuela, flown from Venezuela to the United States as part of this program that the DHS Secretary has put together to just bring people from rogue regimes into the United States? Can you get me that number if you don't have that number?
I can take your question back about the number of Venezuelans who've participated in what I think you're referring to the increased lawful pathways that
Well, it wasn't lawful. Even the administration admitted that that new program violated laws. So the flights that I'm talking about into the interior of the United States from Venezuela, I'd like the number from what state thinks it is. And if you can get that to me in writing later.
Okay, we'll take that question back. Thanks.
I yield.
Thank you, Representative Green. Now I recognize Ranking Member Castro from Texas.
Thank you, Chairwoman. A few things first. I don't envy your work. We participated also determining when sanctions are appropriate and how narrow or how broad those sanctions should be, which individuals to sanction or which sectors to sanction. It really is walking a tightrope. I've supported Venezuelan sanctions in the past and am willing to look at more sanctions. But I think we also have to recognize that how you set those sanctions, you've got to set them in a way that puts enough pressure on a government to do the right thing, in this case, to hold free and fair elections and recognize a legitimate election result, and at the same time doesn't devastate an economy so much that it affects people well beyond those in the elite of government, and it forces mass migration. Look, I agree with the chairwoman that I think there are a lot of Venezuelans who have said and who will leave if Maduro is there for another 2, 3 years, 4 years, whatever it may be. But there will also be a lot of people who will leave if there are sanctions that are put on so harshly that you essentially starve the country and people have no choice but to go. Also, on the situation with recognizing Mundo Gonzalez, it's a double-edged sword because I believe that he won the election. I've said that clearly. At the same time, the imprimatur of the United States carries with it a lot of positives and a lot of strengths, but we've seen historically how it also can play into the hands of dictators because we become their foil to curry favor with what is for them the home team, in this case Venezuelans, and the United States is that big evil empire who is trying to harm us as a country, and so they have successfully, some of them, played this insider-outsider game where these outside folks are trying to tell us who's going to be president and how our country is going to run. So that's why I say it's a tough mix of how you do that. And thank you all for your work and for doing it diligently and thoughtfully. I have a few questions really quick. The first one, since July 28th, a key priority of the United States and many of the other countries in the region has been to push the Maduro regime to enter into negotiations with the opposition regarding a democratic transition with the results, in line with the results of the election. The Maduro regime has broken ties with a number of countries that recognize Edmundo Gonzalez's victory and has diplomatically isolated itself. This has left few avenues to engage with the regime to push it to enter into those negotiations. One such avenue was the Brazil, Colombia, Mexico efforts by Presidents Lula, Petro, and AMLO. Another early channel seemed to be Qatar. Both seem to be dormant at the moment. So I wanted to ask you, Mr. Sullivan, how do you assess the outcomes from these channels? And are there any partners still actively engaging with the regime to push them to enter into negotiation?
Thank you, Ranking Member Castro. Yes, there are international partners that remain actively engaged with Maduro. As you pointed out, it has been very difficult. Maduro and his representatives have really been focused much more on repression and denial since the election. And that's hard for anyone to deal with, whether it's the United States or Brazil. But we have remained in contact with the countries you mentioned, Brazil, Colombia, Mexico, Qatar as well, and of course many of our other partners around the Americas and Europe. There are really a number of countries that are prepared to be helpful, each one coming from where they are with the relationships that they have. I should point out the United States also remains very open to engagement to try and promote the kind of negotiated, peaceful, democratic transition that Venezuelans clearly want. But it does take two to tango. Unfortunately, I think none of our partners has perceived real openness or any flexibility so far from Maduro. But I would go back to your opening statement, Ranking Member Castro, and when you talked about this being the biggest opportunity that we've had for a long time in Venezuela. We continue to believe that's the case. And we also would agree with the idea that there's a lot that can happen between an election and an inauguration. That's certainly the way we're looking at the situation now.
No, well, thank you for that. And also in the last couple of days, news reports and assertions by the Maduro regime alleged that the Spanish government had an active role in Edmundo Gonzalez signing a document recognizing Maduro's electoral victory. Edmundo Gonzalez says he was forced to sign it, has denied the Spanish government was complicit, and the Spanish government also denies any involvement. And so I wanted to ask you, what's your assessment of the situation, and were there external factors coercing Edmundo Gonzalez to sign that document?
Ranking Member Castro, I think Edmundo Gonzalez Urrutia himself has been very clear about what happened. He was coerced by Maduro and some of his representatives into leaving the country after he had been falsely accused of a number of serious crimes, and arrest warrants had been issued for him. That is really the essence of the situation. The Spanish government facilitated his departure to Spain, where fortunately he's safe and out of the reach of Maduro. I would refer you to some of the Spanish government's own statements about what role they played. They helped him find safe haven, essentially. But in terms of coercion and manipulation, I think that there we're talking about Maduro and his representatives.
And by the Spanish government is more on the left, right?
Yes, that's true. But I think the Spanish government, along with really the rest of the European Union, has consistently advocated for transparency in this election, respect for democratic norms. The European Union has put out a number of very strong statements, including some involving all 27 members. And I understand that the government of Spain fully shares those sentiments.
And I say that, or I ask that question, because I mean to say it's not like it's a right-wing government that's attacking Maduro or, implying that this process was unfair because they ideologically disagree with Maduro. And then the point I meant to make also with Edmundo Gonzalez is, the version of what we tried with Guaido, we essentially, I would argue, Chairwoman, I know we can debate it and stuff, but I would argue that we tried that with Guaido, the recognition, and it fell apart. And you know what I've said on Cuba. We kind of see things a little differently, but I don't wish for us to have a similar relationship with another Latin American country the way we've had with Cuba since Castro came into power, which was total isolation. We basically tried to shut them out. Isolate them. We have isolated them. And, the Castros are gone, but it's still the same government. They're driving cars from the 1950s. Nothing's changed. You still have a lot of poverty. And it's just kind of been a stale relationship. That doesn't mean that you just give them whatever they want and everything's cool. But I do think that it's a warning about it's a warning about sometimes about the limits of an approach and how you have to assess along the way what you're doing and what the appropriate actions are. And again, I've supported sanctions on Venezuela. I've supported sanctions on other countries. I don't have a problem on Russia. I don't have a problem imposing sanctions on nations where it's appropriate. But I have learned in my 12 years here and all of those here on this committee that there may not be a perfect answer, but man, you've got to do it. It's got to be calibrated and done the right way. Otherwise, if it goes one way or the other, the wrong, too much, not enough, or too far, the result's going to be bad. So, thank you. I yield back, Chairwoman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I now recognize for 5 minutes Representative Self from the state of Texas.
Thank you, Chairwoman. This committee has done a very good job. Rather than replow old ground, I want to review, first of all, the panel that we have in front of us, and this has a purpose. Mr. Sullivan, you have in your resume, it says you're a strong advocate for democracy and human rights. Mr. Roig, you work for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Mr. Sullivan, you've said respect for the will of the Venezuelan people twice, I think. Mr. Roig, you've said that they are checking the Snapchat of citizens, stopping and checking the Snapchat. Mr. Howell, you said support democratic actors around the world. I think I got that right. So I have a rare opportunity here because in your portfolio, Deputy Assistant Secretary Howell, you have Brazil. So along these lines, I want to, obviously Brazil has been in the news recently because they have frozen access to X in their country. Millions of Brazilians use that service. And Brazil, just to remind everyone here, has a larger GDP than Mexico. It has triple the GDP of the number 2 country in South America. So we are talking about a significant country in South America. Since it's in your portfolio, Deputy Assistant Secretary, you know that the Brazilian judge seized cash from Starlink, related to X, of course, to pay their fines. Now, the American government, I think, along the lines that I just laid out from you 3 gentlemen, ought to be taking steps to ensure that our companies, especially those dedicated to free speech in a regional democracy, are not to be harassed by these nations. And I wish that the Biden administration was as aggressive on Brazil in this case as you seem to indicate you are going to be, you might be, on Venezuela. So first question for you, Mr. Howell, is what is the administration doing, actually doing, not studying, not planning? What are you doing to combat the steps that Brazil has taken to censor their citizens?
Sorry, Congressman, you're looking at me, Deputy Assistant Secretary Sullivan. You said Howell.
I'm sorry, I did, Deputy Assistant Secretary Sullivan. I apologize, Who should I apologize to?
No one, sir. Just clarifying.
Just clarifying. I'm looking at you, Deputy Assistant Secretary Sullivan. Thank you.
Good. Well, I'll be happy to address your question, and I know my colleague Das Roig has also been tracking the Brazil X issue quite carefully from a freedom of expression perspective. But I'll just say that we, of course, have been paying close attention to the situation.
No, I ask, what are you doing?
So we have been in touch with the company, and we have also expressed publicly our ongoing commitment to freedom of expression issues broadly. We have not commented on the specific legal matters because that's not something that we typically do in a case like Brazil.
Okay, very good. The Department of State gives $160 million a year to something called CEPS. For those of you not familiar with it, it's a consortium for elections and political process strengthening, CEPS. Now, apparently, they got $20 million from the Department of State specifically for Brazil-related work in 2021, which was prior to the last presidential election in Brazil. I want to know specifically what was the purpose of those funds, because just for information again, CEPS includes such sub-organizations as Countering Disinformation Project, Countering Disinformation Guide, a database of informational interventions. And here we have this country, CEPS with State Department money. With these organizations, what did they use those $20 million for specifically in Brazil?
Congressman, in this case, I would invite either of my colleagues to indicate whether they're aware of the CEPS grant. We do similar grants sometimes through DRL and sometimes through USAID.
I'm about to run out of time, so I'm going to submit that for response in
writing. We'll be happy to get back to you on that.
And if I may, Chairwoman, one more point. I will also be asking you about the two warships that Brazil's president gave material support to recently, and the Macron is the one I'm most concerned about. It has been renovated into a sea base to include the possibility of Iranian special forces deploying around the world, in this case, in Brazil. I'm very concerned about that. I'll be submitting that question for a response as well. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Self. Now I recognize for 5 minutes Representative Kamlager Dove from the state of California.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for hosting this hearing, and I hope that we can have one similar to this on the issue of Haiti, given the turmoil that's going on in that country and the fact that Haitians are under siege here and abroad. The elections in Venezuela were one of the most impressive exercises of democratic participation that I have seen since joining this committee. In the face of incredible repression and intimidation, the people of Venezuela came out in full force to deliver a resounding verdict against Maduro's authoritarianism. And I want to point out that after 6 years of political stagnation and a worsening humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, it was diplomacy that created an opportunity for Venezuelans to make their voices heard and have agency in their country's future. I also want to say it was diplomacy that brought home 10 Americans, including one of my constituents. And talking points are just that until it's somebody's child. And I prayed regularly with my constituent's father to have him come home. So if there's going to be an alternative outcome for Venezuela, it is going to have to include intensive diplomacy in concert with our regional partners. Deputy Assistant Secretary Sullivan, there's been a lot of discussion about sticks. What are the carrots that are on the table? And is the United States prepared to consider sanctions, relief, or lifting of indictments or other forms of support for officials who have exercised courage and have respected the outcome of Venezuela's elections?
Thanks very much for your question, Congresswoman, and I really appreciate your highlighting the important role that diplomacy played in helping us get to competitive elections in Venezuela, as well as releasing the wrongfully detained Americans last year. We were all very happy to be part of that. In terms of sanctions relief and carrots in general in this situation, we have indicated that we are prepared to look at sanctions relief of all kinds if the Venezuelan democratic process proceeds, if the will of the people is respected. I think that's clear. In terms of our individual sanctions, really they are always put in place as an incentive for individuals to change their behavior in a positive way. We are in a position to review sanctions in the case that individuals, instead of disrupting democratic processes or conducting repression, actually contribute to a positive outcome. Absolutely. I would also highlight that in terms of carrots, really what all of us are looking for is a peaceful democratic transition and as Edmundo Gonzalez, the winner of the presidential election, has said, national reconciliation. I think he has talked, along with Maria Corina Machado, about building a Venezuela for all Venezuelans, that all Venezuelans where they can feel comfortable, where they can go on with their lives, and where people can leave behind the terrible crisis and strife that have gripped the country for years now. And really, in our view, most of the carrots that would be involved in a transition really have to come through Venezuelan-led negotiations that we, as the U.S. government, can support. But there are, of course, a number of issues and angles that the U.S. government does control, and we're happy to put our influence at the service of that kind of national reconciliation.
Thank you. Das Roig, I think the fact that Brazil has allowed Argentina to operate under its flag is a really big deal. We know that Maduro has taken unprecedented steps to intimidate other countries, including breaking off diplomatic relations with Argentina, for sheltering 6 Venezuelan opposition members, and then revoking Brazil's authority to represent Argentina's interests. I think this is a violation of the Vienna Convention. So what is your assessment on the kind of cooperation that these countries can expect from Maduro? Will it be the same as it has been in the past?
Congresswoman, thank you for the question. I mean, here, what I would say is that both Argentina and Brazil have stated their positions clearly. We've expressed our unwavering support for both the governments of Brazil and Argentina in the face of threats to the Embassy of Argentina in Venezuela, as we've also called for the immediate and unconditional release of those unjustly detained and for the safe conduct to allow for the secure departure of Venezuelan democratic opposition leaders from the Argentine embassy. So that's been our clear position on the issue with regards to what's happening with the embassy.
Thank you. I'm out of time. I will submit my last question to have you all respond. And I just want to thank the chair for giving me flexibility with these extra seconds. And I would like to use your Chevron charts in my Natural Resources Committee. I'm putting that on the record. I would love it.
Thanks to you, Representative from California. And now I recognize Mr. Castro for any closing remarks he may have.
Thank you, Chairwoman. As you all know, we only have a few session weeks left in the year, and I know how busy November and December an election year can get. And so I don't know if the subcommittee will hold more hearings during that period. I certainly hope we do, but in the case that we don't, I want to take this opportunity to thank the Chairwoman for her leadership and the members of the subcommittee for their work, particularly Greg Stanton, Sidney Comlonger-Dove, and Jared Moskowitz. I also want to thank the committee staff for their work in keeping the work of this subcommittee going. As you all know, anybody that's worked on Capitol Hill knows that the staff they're the real drivers of a lot of the work that we do. And that includes Sid Ravishankar, Jaya Kirtapal, Rodrigo Garza, Russell Brooks, Radhika Prabhu, Sahika Carr Johnson with the Democratic staff, and also with the Republicans, Ricardo Pita, Maggie Gosler, Christy Cortocrax, Jacob De Peralta, and Ana Quintanilla, all with the Republican staff. Also on the chairwoman's staff, John Mark Kolb and Austin Johnson. And thank you all so much for your work and the issues that we've discussed, the debate. You can tell the debate has been lively these 2 years, but I think it's been important that we've covered these issues. So thank you. I yield back, Chairwoman.
Thanks to you, and I agree with the whole staff for this wonderful committee. Dems and Republican working together, and it's a delight to be working with you, Ranking Member Castro. And I now recognize myself for any closing remarks. I wanted to thank all of you for being here. As I said at the beginning, this is not a partisan issue. This is an issue that is of high regard and extremely important for Democrats and for Republicans, because we all want democracy, freedom, free market economy, and have a prosperous hemisphere. Before I mention or I express my closing remarks, I have one more question, which I just would like you to confirm, Ambassador Sullivan. We have reports that between October 2023 and May of 2024, Maduro's coffers received between $1.1 and $1.5 billion because of the sanctions allowed by the United States government. Could you confirm that figure?
Chairwoman, thanks for the question. We can't confirm a particular figure. There have been a variety of estimates of the revenues that Maduro has received. There are some commercially available, but I can't confirm any particular number today.
Could you share the numbers that you feel comfortable with? Because you need to, I mean, I'm sure that you have tallies of how much the Maduro regime is receiving because of our concessions.
I'll take that question back.
So if you can next week, we would like to see if we can gather that information from the State Department, if that it's possible.
Sure, we'll get back to you.
My closing remarks are extremely sad. I'm very worried. The Biden administration has not done what it committed to, which was to follow the Barbados Accords. If Maduro followed what was agreed on and committed to, which was to respect the results of free and fair elections in Venezuela on July 28th. It was very clear that we were going to lift the sanctions, but if he did not, then the sanctions were going to be reimposed. And that did not happen. And that is highly disappointing, very disappointing. The Democrats, unfortunately, and you know I'm one of the most bipartisan members of the United States Congress, the Biden-Harris administration have not been present, and they have not helped the millions of Venezuelans who voted against the Maduro regime. And there was an agreement, the Barbados Accords, and we, the United States, we did not follow it. And that is highly disappointing, because I would have wanted the Biden-Harris administration to step up to the plate and help Maria Corina Machado. I would have been the first one saying, bravo, Mr. President, but he did not. So if Maria Corina Machado goes to jail, It's clearly on the Biden administration. And I want to leave that on the record because Edmundo Gonzalez left. She is the last man standing. Do you agree with me?
Congresswoman, Chairwoman, we have great respect for the incredible bravery and work of Maria Corina Machado. We are very closely tracking her welfare and will continue to do so as this situation unfolds. We remain in close contact with her.
Thank you. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to those questions in writing. Pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned, and thanks again for being here.